So if you saw the Goodreads Choice Award nominees for 2025, you probably thought that list is really freaking straight and white. The discourse has been going around online for the past couple weeks ever since the nominees got announced. And this is something that happens like literally every year that the Choice Awards have been happening. If you're new here, I'm JEN-nuh-nee and I've been a booktuber since 2017. So I've been here for 8 years. And every year I have seen the same discourse come up again and again. And it's always seen as like a critique of Goodreads itself. But I do think that we are missing the fact that Goodreads is a reflection of its users and the general habits of regular readers. So today I want to do a deep dive on Goodreads, on why the awards are so straight and white. And I also want to talk about how simply leaving the platform for a different one like Storygraph is not quite the solution that you think it is, especially when it comes to supporting the careers of marginalized authors. So most people are pretty aware that the Goodreads Choice Awards are based off of reader scores or user scores on the platform, whether that is average star ratings of a book or the number of shelves that a book has. This means the number of times it's been added to a shelf by a user, and the most frequent shelf that's kind of looked at is the want to read shelf, but also the read shelf. Now, the quickest and easiest, argument against Goodreads is that it is, racist and bad, and that it's owned by Amazon, and so therefore it is bad. And while to a certain extent, yes, it's bad because it is owned by Amazon, it's not that simple, especially if you're actually interested in fighting for more diversity in publishing and actually supporting marginalized authors. But first, let's set the stage. So let's talk about Goodreads demographics. A lot of the stats I'm going to talk about today are from an article by Book Riot, which was written by Kelly Jensen, and it was called The Unbearable Whiteness of the Goodreads Choice Awards. Excellent article. You should definitely go give it a read. I'll leave it linked in the description. But the high-level breakdown of the demographics of Goodreads and just some facts that you should know. Amazon bought Goodreads in 2013 when it was at roughly 16 million users. Now in 2025, Goodreads has over 150 million users, and roughly 6.2 million users voted in the 2024 Goodreads Choice Awards. Now, one critique of the Choice Awards that I see pretty often is that the nominees are very US and North American centric. And part of that just has to do with the fact that Goodreads' user base is 48% based in the US, which means for the most part, they are going to be reading books that are published in the US and that are marketed to them in the US. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't maybe expect them to broaden their horizons and maybe try to read from, around the world. But alas, that is just an element of this. They are getting marketed a certain number of books. So it is not a surprise that most of the books are very US and North American centric. But 48% of users is quite significant, and all of them are based in the US. The next highest percentages are 7% in the UK, 6% in Canada, 4% in Australia, and 3% in India. So already you can see the top 4 countries that are represented in the Goodreads user base are all Western English-speaking countries, which kind of makes sense. The platform is owned by Amazon. It is also an English platform, so it makes sense that, it's mainly English-speaking countries. And then from there, we have about 60% of the user base identifying as female. Not so surprising, but the Book Riot article does go into the fact that some of the earliest years of the Goodreads Choice Awards, there were some years where no women were winning, even though most of the user base on Goodreads were women. In terms of ages, most of the user base is under 44 years old. 30% of all users are between the ages of 25 and 34. 21% of all users are between the ages of 18 and 24. And then 18% are between the ages of 35 and 44. So definitely a younger demographic and probably a really good overlap with social media itself and people who are involved in the bookish communities on the various social media platforms. Now, when it comes to race, this is where you can really see the reflection of the Choice Awards. This is a direct quote from the Book Riot article. Goodreads users are 77% Caucasian, 9% Hispanic, 7% African American, and 6% Asian, and 1% other. In other words, just over 7.5 out of every 10 users on the site are white. In 2022, the United States as a whole had roughly 59% of its population identified as white. So already we can see that the platform skews to more white users than even what's represented in the population. And from there, we can kind of see why so many books by white authors are popular on the platform. It's also interesting to see how these stats are fairly reflective of the public publishing industry itself and the people who work in the publishing industry. This is the Lee and Low Diversity Baseline Survey 3.0, which is a diversity survey of the publishing industry and people who work in it. And as you can see from this graphic, about 72.5% of the publishing industry is made up of white Caucasian employees. And of course, when we have an industry that is mainly made up of white people, we are going to see that reflected in the books that are published. Very often without, people of color within the industry championing their own voices and voices like them, it is very hard to get those voices heard. Now, despite the unbearable whiteness of Goodreads as a platform, the Choice Awards have actually had a fluctuating number of authors of color honored as nominees year to year. The most notable spikes are, of course, in 2017 to 2018, and then, of course, in 2020. 2017 was the year that the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally happened, and a lot of, backlash in reaction to that happened. And it's also the year that The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas was published, which was a book that completely took the publishing industry by storm, and it also became the one book by a Black author that many white readers were reading and, pointing to as the proof that they weren't racist. 2020 was obviously the year of George Floyd and also the Black Lives Matter protests, and just this overall surge in US publishing where people were buying anti-racist books, saying they would do the work and really interrogate the racism in the country. But of course, a lot of it ended up being very performative. We are 5 years down the line. Most people have not read those anti-racist books that they bought, and the status quo has kind of returned to where it was back in 2020, especially when we look at the stats of the Goodreads Choice Awards. The years that we see a spike in authors of color being nominated are the years where white readers felt motivated by guilt and this, desire to perform their anti-racism. And so they were picking up books by authors of color and by Black authors. And so that was naturally reflected in the stats of the platform, and which got those books risen up to the nominee level. But if we look at the years directly preceding and, succeeding those spike years, they are much, much lower. So we've established that Goodreads is a platform that is mainly filled with white users. And one argument that I constantly see whenever, the discussion of Goodreads and the Goodreads Choice Awards comes up is that, we should all just leave it and move to StoryGraph. It's Black owned. It is, not owned by Amazon. It's more ethical. But interestingly, despite these, fundamental ethical differences in the platforms, the users on StoryGraph imitate many of the behaviors of the users on Goodreads. Silvia Moreno-Garcia, who is an author that I absolutely adore, wrote a Patreon article titled "The Goodreads Awards Are Our Imperfect Reflection." She outlines how, in many cases, if StoryGraph were to have these similar awards based on user scores, the books by white authors would still win. The common denominator being that the reader and user scores and behavior on those platforms still systemically favor white authors. I'm going to read you the example that she kind of shared in her article. The suggestion that all would be better if we simply move to StoryGraph is disproven once you look quickly at the book stats over there. For example, on Goodreads, Mate by Ali Hazelwood has been rated by over 100,000 users, has 19,000 reviews, and a rating of 4.18. On StoryGraph, it is rated 4.23 based on 18,000 reviews. The Wrath of the Fallen by Amber V. Nicole, one of the 2 Black authors to make the Romantasy nominee list, has almost 5,000 ratings on Goodreads, with 1,100 reviews and a rating of 4.42. On StoryGraph, it has 388 reviews and a score of 4.48. The most popular Romantasy novels, such as Mate, Onyx Storm, or The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy, are still more popular on StoryGraph and would win against most books by authors of color. Another example she provides is of herself in the horror category. On StoryGraph, The Bewitching, which is her novel, has a 4.04 rating and almost 6,000 reviews. The Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Indigenous author Stephen Graham Jones scores at 4.25 and 8,800 reviews. However, Witchcraft for Wayward Girls by Grady Hendrix, who is a white author and who was also nominated nominated in the horror category, leaves them in the dust with 21,000 reviews on Storygraph. And the pattern is repeated on Goodreads, where Stephen Graham Jones and Silvia Moreno-Garcia have similar shots based on review numbers, but Grady Hendrix is leaps ahead of them. So although both marginalized authors, do score better on Storygraph, they're still leagues behind the white author. And this is what I mean. It's not necessarily that Goodreads itself is the problem. It's the systemic racism going on. It's the systemic racism within the industry, within the way readers interact with books, and the way that publishing puts money behind books by white authors. And so those often are the books that are being read more, being reviewed more, and being reviewed more positively. So the argument in favor of Storygraph is honestly a very slim one. It's kind of based on this idea of a very simplistic boycott. If we leave Goodreads altogether and just go for a more ethical platform like Storygraph, we'll solve the problem. But it's not that simple. The other aspect to this beyond the systemic racism within the industry is the fact that Storygraph is built more like a personal reading tracker app versus a social platform for readers the way that Goodreads is built. On Goodreads, many readers discover books through the activity of other users on the platform. When you log on to Goodreads, the first thing on your homepage is the activity of other users. What books they have reviewed, what books they have rated, what books they are adding to their shelves. That is what you see first, and that is the main core element of the platform beyond cataloging all these books and allowing you to track your own reading. Whereas Storygraph is much more focused on your own personal reading tracking. And this is a very key difference. It seems small, but it's a very key difference in why user interfaces and the way that apps are built are very, very important, because they affect the user behavior on that platform. Now, even beyond that, since its inception, Goodreads has positioned itself as the perfect marketing tool for publishers and also one of the biggest indicators of success for a book for publishers. Goodreads truly has the biggest chokehold on the publishing industry, and I say this as someone who used to work in publishing. Publishers put enormous amount of weight on how successful a book is on Goodreads, especially prior to its publication, to prove how successful it will be in real life. Publishers are frequently looking at want to read shelves for books, and that is a really easy stat and piece of data that they can collect to then share with, retailers and sales reps to further get more stock into stores and sell the book more. This is often why authors are asking you to add their book to your Goodreads shelf, because it is an indicator of success to their publisher. And when you're a marginalized author, you are grasping at every little piece of information and, thing that you can do to prove to your publisher that you are worth taking a bet on, because the industry is already set up against you and they already want to believe that you are not going to succeed. In recent years, Goodreads has also upped its editorial game. They have these listicles and recommendation posts that have gained a lot of popularity in recent years, and they sort of function just like any other listicle on a major media outlet. Just like how some media outlet might do all of the, best books coming out this month, Goodreads also does a similar thing. And a lot of people find books through those listicles. I had someone comment that oh, I've never even noticed this feature on Goodreads on one of my other videos about Goodreads. And to that I say, just because it didn't work on you doesn't mean it's not working on thousands of other people. I also remember several years back when I used to work in publishing, I used to have some senior colleagues tell me about how back in the day, they had several different options between both print and online media to advertise the books that they were marketing and get them featured and reviewed and placed in places that people would actually see. But with the rise of social media and, this shift towards STEM fields and the deprioritization of media outlets and the lack of funding for them and the fact that so many have closed down, there are so few places for marketers at publishers to market books to readers, to market them in places that are specifically for readers. There used to be many more media outlets dedicated to reading and, books, but they've dwindled over the years. So when you're a marketer at a publisher, you're already grasping at straws trying to reach, readers in their niche spaces. And Goodreads is one of the few places that actually lets you advertise to a specifically niche bookish reader audience. And it also lets you do this in a very low effort way. Goodreads allows for banner ads and sponsored posts, and it also allows publishers to pay for Goodreads giveaways, which allows the publishers to get readers to add a book to their want to read shelf to enter to win a copy. And those giveaways can be very successful for a lot of books and often are the reason that books spike up in want to read shelves on the platform, and also why they get just more exposure. Silvia Moreno-Garcia also went through this in a different article about, whether awards even make a difference. And I would say that in silo, they don't necessarily make a difference, but it all ends up being a cumulative effect. Marketing is literally just getting something in front of someone's face enough times before they are convinced that they want it. And awards kind of help with that because it's just yet another exposure point for a customer. All this to say, and I kind of said this in a Instagram reel and YouTube short that I posted earlier this month, although it's easy to say that we should just abandon Goodreads for something like Storygraph, we are missing the crucial element of how Goodreads plays such an important role in the publishing industry and in how readers discover books. And when we're talking about supporting marginalized authors, if we abandon them on one of the largest platforms in the industry, the one that publishers are looking at, we are truly doing them a disservice. BIPOC authors still receive an ungodly amount of just terrible ratings and reviews on Goodreads and also on retailer websites. And part of the work of supporting them is counteracting all of that systemic racism on these existing platforms. When publishing is looking to determine the success of a book before it even comes out, if, a marginalized author's book doesn't have enough want to read shelves, then they're just going to assume that, we do not care about that book. I think Storygraph is great, and I think it's great for tracking your own reading, but I do encourage you to maybe consider using Goodreads in a strategic manner. These days, I track my own reading on my own personal Notion reading tracker that is offline. It's separate from any online platform, and it's something that only I can see. And I like it that way because I can track my own reading in a very honest and open way for myself without worrying that someone is going to see something and misunderstand, the way I rated something or the way that I wrote a review or whatever. But I also like to keep that as my own personal record. And then every few weeks, I try to go on Goodreads and add books by marginalized authors onto my want to read shelves. And I mark books by BIPOC and marginalized authors that I've read as read on the platform. And then I go ahead and rate them 5 stars or leave them beautiful glowing reviews, even if it wasn't my favorite book. Because the truth is that this industry is so terribly set up for marginalized authors, for BIPOC authors, and using Goodreads strategically is one of the few things that we can do to really support them. I have a whole article on my bindery community that you can go check out of 10 different ways to support marginalized and BIPOC authors for free without spending any money. And this is one of those ways. Adding their books on your want to read shelves on Goodreads, rating them highly and reviewing them honestly on Goodreads and on retailer platforms. And then the final point that I kind of wanted to make here was that we can still push for better as we wait for and, build up an alternative platform from Goodreads. I do agree in an idealistic sense that, Goodreads being owned by Amazon, not great. However, in practice, until we have a better alternative that fulfills the same functions that Goodreads does in the industry and for, discoverability, we are doing a disservice to marginalized authors by simply abandoning them on Goodreads. It feels like the very slippery slope of the way that we all left Twitter in this mass exodus. But truly, Twitter was one of the few places that marginalized authors had built up significant platforms and could reach their readers. And that all kind of just disappeared overnight, including a lot of the networking and connections that existed on Twitter between publishing professionals and writers and agents and marginalized authors. There were so many mentorship programs and, pitch fests and pitch wars type of programs that existed on Twitter that we've just kind of lost. And so when I hear people talking about Goodreads in the sense of just, abandon it, we should just be on Storygraph, that's kind of missing the point of how this tool is a tool and we should be trying to use it in a way that still benefits marginalized authors rather than just kind of giving up and throwing our hands up in the air. And you know what? There are other alternatives for reading tracking and, reading social apps, things like Storygraph, Fable, Pagebound. But again, all of these are nowhere near the level that Goodreads is in the industry. And until we can figure out a way to make these other platforms really challenge Goodreads in the industry, I think going on Goodreads to only add marginalized authors to your shelves and to only add good ratings for marginalized authors, that will do so freaking much for them. And part of this is also, I think that we deserve to ask more of a large platform like Goodreads. Beyond just being aware of our internalized biases as users on Goodreads and then also combating the systemic racism on the platform, I think we can also push against things like the Choice Awards. I've been seeing so many hot takes about how the Choice Awards are based off of user data and, the books that they shelve and, what's popular on the platform. And while that's true and while we should acknowledge that and try to change that, just blaming that is kind of a fatalistic take. Yes, the nominees are selected by whatever is popular on the platform, but there are still actual humans behind these awards. There's an actual editorial team who is behind choosing the categories, making the categories, slotting things into categories, and choosing how to essentially run these awards. Literally the other day, Goodreads posted a Instagram reel of their editorial team who analyzes the reader data on the platform to create the nominee list. And although in early days of Goodreads, it was almost impossible to find people behind, the screen for Goodreads, these days there are people, and there are active people who are choosing how this awards goes. Award criteria and methodology is something that can always be changed. And even beyond this sort of mandate of, going based off of whatever readers like and choose, the way that they frame the categories is still up to them. I think it still makes sense to push back against these awards and ask why their methodology allows for one author to be nominated 3 times within the same category, to ask why they've collapsed nonfiction into only 2 categories and making for even less space to honor and support marginalized authors. We can push back against why they have completely gotten rid of the children's categories. These are all things that the actual humans behind Goodreads and the Choice Awards have control over. With that said, I think those are all of my points in regards to this topic on Goodreads. I know a lot of people are kind of tired of this topic and feel like it's something that's come up, so many times and comes up every single year, but I do feel like a lot of times we are missing the nuances of this situation and how Goodreads is such an integral part of the publishing industry at this point in time, and how we are doing a disservice to marginalized authors and BIPOC authors if we don't use this tool to their advantage. And that's simply something I want you guys to consider. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new and that you're considering Goodreads in a different light. Thank you to my Bindery members for supporting me and my channel. And if you are interested in supporting yet another BIPOC author, I just want to remind you that the next book coming out from my publishing imprint, Boundless Press, which is Burn the Sea by Mona Tavari, is coming out in April 2026. And you can add it now on your Goodreads to your want to read shelf and show retailers that there is a lot of interest in this book simply through the data on Goodreads. So if you don't mind adding it to your want to read shelf, I'll leave the link down below. Thank you all so much for watching again, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye.